All right, I'm really happy to see that every seat is filled. Welcome to this evening's talks at the Pulitzer Center. We appreciate everyone who's come here amidst the deluge, and we're also grateful to those around the world who are watching our live stream to learn about the most recent reporting on the Panama Papers with a focus on Africa. Building communities surrounding these issues and these global topics is a large part of what we do to help the journalists' stories continue to live on, whether it's in the classroom, on our curriculum, on our lesson builder tool, the university seminars that our journalists go to, or at public events like this one. Our first step is to support travel for journalists reporting trips, as well as educational programming across age groups to help students think critically about the creation and dissemination of news, and to inspire them to become more active consumers and producers of information. So, now that you know a little bit more about us, I want to start out with a couple logistics. Restrooms are on either side of the elevator, so you need to walk out of the room. And if you're live tweeting tonight, first, please silence your phone, but also keep in mind the handles of the journalists and the experts that we have on their bio sheets, as well as hashtag Panama Papers that we have up here. After the moderated discussion, we will have a great Q&A, I'm sure. I'm sure you guys all have a lot of questions, and I'm really looking forward to hearing those answers. Just keep in mind to wait till you receive this really special mic before you start speaking, so that the people on live stream, and we can already guarantee there are people watching it, and we're really glad about that, that way that they can hear your questions and the speaker's answers as well. So, now that all that's out of the way, tonight we have Pulitzer Center grantee and International Consortium of Investigative Journalists reporter Will Fitzgibbon, as well as senior editor of Voice of America and ICIJ member Ray Choto, who will examine the Panama Papers and tell us about how Africa and the individuals and the businesses who reap profit from all of these things that are going on. So we also have Ian Gary, Associate Policy Director of Fueling Development at Oxfam, and Porter McConnell, Director of the Financial Transparency Coalition, who are here to explore why transparency in the financial and extractive sectors is crucial to Africa's development. You can learn more about our speakers up here by reading the bio sheets that we provided for you. As part of the new Panama Papers revelations from Africa, the Pulitzer Center supported development of a game called Continent of Secrets, uncovering Africa's offshore empires, which you can find on the ICIJ website. Based on the Panama Papers, that lets you discover the widespread, corrupt, and often harmful offshore networks that deprive African countries of billions of dollars. So Will show you more on that and on ICIJ journalists' other findings in Africa to begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And thank you everyone for coming this evening. I apologise in advance to those who got wet or to those who might miss either a convention speech or a particularly entertaining Twitter feed, whichever one is your preference. We're here tonight to talk about Panama Papers and a recent round of reporting that I hope some of you have seen, indeed all of you have seen, that has a particular focus on Africa. Panama Papers, I would hope for many of you, is a project that almost needs no introduction. It's the largest investigative global collaboration that focused on 11.5 million files from a particular law firm that specializes in the creation of shell companies in nearly every country of the world, and as we'll see, that has a particularly strong presence in Africa. Panama Papers came out in April, was the subject of global reaction, political scandal, and also reaction in terms of investigations, inquiries, and even protests and yogurt throwing in Iceland. But what we at ICIJ with our members wanted to do was to take that further. After the initial wave of Panama Papers, many of us were getting tweets at varying levels of complementarity saying, well done, but where's the next round? And I think in particular in Africa, we at ICIJ decided that we had such great partners and we had such great information that really the world very often doesn't get to see. So that led to what we're here talking about today, which is Panama Papers focus on Africa. I suppose why we thought that was necessary was in large part to do with this. The Panama Papers in red represents the scale of the data leak that led to this project. And on the left-hand side, you can see how that compares to previous leaks, both that ICIJ has worked on in the past, and indeed to WikiLeaks. So we're talking about an enormous amount of information. And even if many of us spent far too much time and slept far too little over the course of a year looking through these documents, there was still a lot more to be found. I remember most recently, it was only a few weeks ago, even before publication, that I came across a court document within the Panama Papers that alleged a significant European oil company had facilitated or paid a bribe of over $15 million to someone in Libya. So the fact that we're still finding this kind of information in the Panama Papers indicates that there's a lot more there to be found. And of course, one of our models at ICIJ is that it's not Will Fitzgibbon sitting in Washington DC who's going to find the best stories. It's people like Ray Choto, who's here with us tonight, who spent years and years working in Zimbabwe, who has the phone numbers of any minister you could want at the touch of a fingertip, and who can get that information and tell the stories that matter in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. Secondly, in terms of why this was important, was to continue the thread of so much information. A simple search of the Panama Papers for South Africa revealed over 42,000 results. That's a lot of results. We had about 6 journalists in South Africa working on this, but there is still, I can guarantee you, information within there that hasn't been mined. I think what other reasons why this was so important to do was figures like this. A random contract, a document for $792 million US that, to my knowledge, is yet to be reported on. There may be a story there, there may not, but these are the kind of things that exist within the Panama Papers and are yet to be fully explored, and that related to Nigerian oil contracts. And then one of my personal favourites, a document here that was signed between an offshore company and an Angolan oil company, which pretty much guaranteed, well, provided for 15 million euros, and in the next paragraph you see that actually, even if the person who signed this document didn't do any work at all, they'd still get 10 million euros, which I'm sure many of us wouldn't mind here. And then the final example I wanted to give was one from a story we wrote. This is a visualization of the network within Mossack Fonseca, which is one law firm alone, of a well-known mining businessman by the name of Benjamin Steinmetz. This company over here represented a particular mining company in Sierra Leone that ICIJ and partners wrote a story on. But as you can see, according to the Mossack Fonseca files, there's an entire network of other companies and other individuals linked to that one single company and perhaps to that one single person. It's worth noting here, of course, that in communications with that individual and representative, we were told that many of these companies were unknown to him. And then finally, I wanted to move to the question of how this all happens with all this information. How does ICIJ work together to collaborate? How do you bring 400 and probably more these days, 500 journalists together to report on a particular story? And the short answer is lots of bending over backwards. Some of these people will catch each other, 1 or 2 might drop someone, but what we're working together to do is to somersault through the sky and produce quality investigative journalism that crosses borders. In this particular Africa-focused investigation, we were very lucky to have what I think is, and I stand to be corrected by anyone in the room or on social media, the largest collaboration of African newsrooms working together not only on a particular topic, but towards a particular deadline and with a particular focus in mind. And this ranges from Ray's Zimbabwean Voice of America, larger countries in Nigeria, to small little nations whose newspapers you've probably never heard of in Togo or Niger. And as I hope we maybe will speak about a bit more tonight, what's really important from ICIJ's perspective is that a story that is big in the US or is big in Nigeria is equally as big in Niger. And just because we don't hear about it on Channel 4 News or BBC News, or because it's not repeated in the New York Times, doesn't mean that it's not a story worth telling. And yet, it's only the journalist in Niger who knows what that story is going to be. These are some of the headlines and front pages that came out on Monday or Tuesday. There are more to come, as Ray I'm sure will tell you. And then I just wanted to move quickly on to what Lauren was talking about, the Continent of Secrets quiz that Pulitzer Center very graciously and generously supported. Pulitzer Center has funded ICIJ on a number of projects now. First, we worked together to produce a visual multimedia presentation relating to mining in Africa. With the first release of Panama Papers, they helped us produce an animated video that told the story of the victims of Panama Papers. And this one, perhaps our most ambitious, was trying to convey the massive information from Panama Papers in a way that people will understand. How do you convey the fact that 52 out of the 54 African countries used or had businesses that used offshore companies created by Panama Papers without bullet points and without people losing interest within 2 seconds? We hope that this game goes some way to answer that question. And for those of you who haven't played it, there is an increasingly competitive scoreboard at the end of it, and I trust that someone in this room, after our conversation tonight, will perhaps be able to shoot to number one. And this is just a brief view of how it works. We've got sliders to guess questions, we've got funky maps, the aim of which, as I said at the beginning, was to show how widespread this phenomenon is. You click on a country, you find out that a company that exported hibiscus flowers from Sudan set up an offshore company, a frozen meat company in Namibia, as well as the more expected companies such as oil in Libya, Egypt, and Nigeria. Safaris too. If you haven't read the story, I thoroughly recommend it. Something that interested us, or me at least, in the reporting was the fact that more than 30 safari companies across Africa were using offshore companies to do some of their transactions in ways that experts we spoke to, including some from Oxfam, said raised red flags about why on earth you would need to send revenue from safaris in Zimbabwe to the British Virgin Islands and then to the Isle of Man. So I'm going to leave that there on the hopeful note that you'll click open the game if you haven't done so yourself, and I'm going to pass on to Ray Choto, ICIJ member and our Zimbabwe veteran. And Ray, do you just want to lead us through some of your most recent reporting, both from the beginning of Panama Papers and maybe what you're currently working on, if that's safe to talk about?
Thank you very much, Will. As Will has said, he has been the guy leading the coordination for the African reporting as far as the Panama Papers are concerned. So he has been one of the busiest person when it comes to communicating with the journalists in Africa and those who are operating outside Africa, but being African journalists. I'm one of those people. It has not been an easy thing because when the documents were brought to our attention, the general thinking was that you would go into the data and all of a sudden you pick a story to write about. That's not it. It's quite a complicated process. You need to know quite a lot of stuff. For my case, I started working on the Zimbabwe mining company, which is called Zimplats, and it took me several months to really pick up a story. It was not easy. You need to understand what is going on. There's a lot of paper trail, there's a lot of emails that are being written. But there was only one sentence which caught my eye, which was this company was set for the purpose of remunerating managers at Zimplats. And I said, why managers in Zimbabwe should be paid by a company that is based offshore? I started looking at the Zimbabwean laws. What do they say? So you need to build a case to really come up with a story to say, oh, there was some kind of wrongdoing here. I looked into the Zimbabwean laws and found out that what this company was doing is illegal. Because if you are employed in Zimbabwe by a company that is registered in Zimbabwe, you have to be paid in Zimbabwe. So what this company was simply doing was to have an offshore account for these managers so that they are not being taxed. So in a way, they were not paying taxes to the Zimbabwe government. We made a follow-up with the company. It refused that it was not involved in that business, and it never knew the companies that are operating from the BVI, and some of them from Panama. But further digging established that some of the executives from that company were asked to submit their passports, their utility bills, to ensure that these companies, when they are now paying these people money, they are paying money to real people, not just names. So the question was, why would managers in Africa send their passport details, their utility details, if they were not benefiting from this? Could it be somebody sent down to photocopy their documents and send them without their knowledge? It's everyone's guess that these guys were really doing this, knowing very well that they were trying to avoid paying taxes. We've also discovered that some of the companies, as we might start to think that, oh, it's being done in the British Virgin Island. We discovered some of the clients, like the company that is run by some Zimbabweans and South Africans, Northwood Wishment. It's a company which has brought in business for Mosaic Fonseca. We are talking about hundreds and hundreds of companies that have been incorporated in offshore havens. So the Zimbabweans and South Africans and some of the people in Africa are actually involved in this. But who are they working with? You find out that they are working with people with big businesses the world over. There are cases where we have some British guys who own almost mines in Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, Gabon, Mozambique, and they are busy refusing to pay taxes in those countries. And some of them, they're being taken to the courts. But the interesting thing is when you approach those governments, they don't want to talk about it. They are aware that they are taking these guys to court, and these issues are being discussed. But you ask yourself, why is there this lack of transparency when it comes to issues that have to do with taxes? There is a case of a company which I'm working on, it's still work in progress, where the company, after selling 50% of its shares in Gabon, was supposed to have paid capital gains tax to the Gabonese government. It did not. It was asked, it refused. They went to court. The court found out that this company should have paid the government of Gabon that money. But you go and ask the government of Gabon to talk about it, they don't want it. You go to the company to talk about it, nobody wants to talk. Then we are left as journalists to tell the story, that this is what is happening. Why are they protecting these companies? Is it that part of the government officials are involved? In some cases, yes. We have found that some of the government officials are involved in this. They actually help these companies to set up companies in the country. For a good example, in Zimbabwe, there is no way you can be involved in mining without the support of the political elite. That's the corruption which is there. So for a British guy to have a mining company operating in Zimbabwe, it means there must have been some kind of communication with the political establishment in the country. So we've got cases where we have these people with lots of money, they come to invest in these countries. What do? They avoid taxes, they bring in equipment which is overpriced, so that when they want to claim some money, they don't have to pay any taxes. It's a problem which is affecting so many countries in Africa. Is it that they are not capable of identifying it? Or is it just there is no political will to deal with this issue? You'll find some cases where we have got countries like South Africa, which have actually gone to investigate some of the equipment that was coming outside South Africa to really establish whether that was the proper value of the equipment that was declared when it was taken to South Africa. Only to discover that, you know what, the invoices that they were given was far much than the actual price for the equipment that was brought into the country. These are techniques and loopholes which these guys who are smart in terms of law. We are dealing with lawyers here, very smart. One simple mistake, they'll come and sue you, and they know their business. So they've also studied the laws that have to do with the exit control of countries. they know how to play around and make sure that the paper trail is not. That's why we think the anonymous, whistleblower who brought this document to ICIJ, without that person, I'm telling you, this story could not be told today, because there is a lot that is going on. When we got into the data, you don't know exactly what is going on. You keep on having to dig by way of looking for names of people or companies and follow the paper trail. The case in Zimbabwe, which we are finding very complicated, is the involvement of the political elite, like the president himself, who is linked to all these issues that have to do with diamonds and things like that. But when you go into the data, there is no paper trail. You can only get probably some people who are closely associated with him, but him as the president and his ministers, there is no way that you are going to identify them. So far, is it that they are not involved in this dirty business and things like that? I wouldn't want to think so. I think they are, in one way or another. You look at a country which had diamonds, and the president of the country comes to tell the nation that $15 billion was not accounted for, when in fact the Zimbabwe government owns 50% of the shares in most of these diamond companies. So is it true that what the president is telling the nation is really true, or there's some kind of cover-up, which becomes our responsibility now? But when we do that job, we are now also coming up with this kind of journalism where we involve the audiences and the communities, where they're coming in with information. Some people used to think that information belongs to experts and researchers. I'm telling you, people in the communities, they know who is who and who is doing what. They become part of the sources for the story to get more details about these people. We've established that in Zimbabwe there are so many people who are just listed as directors, when in reality they are not directors. They are directors, yes, but they're just friends. But how do you establish? The politicians are not listed, and you will never get their names. These are some of the challenges that we are coming across, but in the end, you get some kind of information which link these directors, their connections with these politicians, some of the business probably that they do or establish outside whatever arrangement that is going on. I would go back to the company called Northern Witchwood, which was set up by a South African and also a Zimbabwean guy. They list the conversation that they were having with Mossack Fonseca, and at times Mossack Fonseca would even pay for their hotel bills, for their travel arrangements to fly probably, let's say, from Jersey going to Panama, or from Panama to go to another jurisdiction where they will have to go and discuss. Because they said information that they didn't want to have paper trail on. You can tell from the discussion that, oh, this one is a hot issue, they're trying to discuss it. Then the next thing you hear, okay, by the way, we're having a seminar which will be addressing such things. Would you be in a position and we're willing to pay for your travel expenses and everything, including hotel accommodation and food? There are cases where they've actually gone out to an extent that they'll be dining and wining, meaning to say that they'll be thanking these guys as their clients who are bringing them good businesses. But at the end of the day, where the business is generating its money, we've seen quite a lot of human rights violation, where in some mining communities, people do not have access to clean water. The mine sludge or industrial effluent is being dumped into public water courses, and the environmental authorities in those countries may be effective, but there is a lot of corruption that is going on. They may go and write a report as what we found, only to be told that that report was done 3 years ago, when the residents in the community are telling their stories about what is happening. Because I am here in Washington, I asked the environmental management in South Africa or in Zimbabwe what they are trying to do to address pollution. They will tell you, oh, we've done a BCD. This is only something that is written in paper. You ask the authorities, the residents, they will tell you, oh, we remember there was something that was done 3 years ago, but come and see the pollution. We send reporters to go and see. Sure, there is pollution that is going on here. We also have to look at the issue of local communities which are not having access to employment. They claim to be getting into Africa to help the people of Africa. Yes, they are helping the people of Africa, but certain countries have got laws which empowers the community to have a share from the process from the mining activities in the area in which they are. They make that promise on paper that they'll be giving them. There is no follow-up. You ask the residents, they're not getting anything. You look at some of these companies, they are privately limited companies. It means that they don't have to disclose their books of accounts to the public. So who knows what's happening there? There's a lot of lack of transparency when it comes to mining contracts and the operations of companies that have to do with minerals and natural resources. I would want to probably give it to the next speaker. I can see Will is holding his hand up. I wanted to keep on going and going. And there's somebody from Zimbabwe who is the last on the alphabet. I thought it was the last to speak, but I'll let you do myself.
I don't know, do you want me to, I might throw some questions at you, if that's okay to get things started. And starting off with you, Ian. Thanks very much, Ray. So we've heard here from Ray some experiences in a very Zimbabwean context in terms of the impacts of extractive industries, the alleged connections between government and extractive industries, environmental impacts, questions of tax. Can you, given your experience with Oxfam and your work on extractives, give us a sense of how much further this goes beyond Zimbabwe and also how much further this goes beyond Africa?
Sure. Well, first I wanted to say thanks to ICIJ and to all the brave and courageous reporters who are collaborating with you on this project. When you're dealing with extractive industries, you're really touching the third rail of politics in many of these countries where money, politics, and power come together. So it's an extremely brave and vital work that ICIJ and the journalists that you're working with are collaborating on. The second point is more directly to your question is that this is not an African problem. This is a global problem, and it involves a global system. And as the Panama Papers show, there are whole networks of facilitators, lawyers, real estate agents, bankers, and others, many based in northern countries who are helping facilitate this issue. In addition to that, even in places like the United States, where you have extractive industries, you have corruption. Several years ago, the U.S. Department of Interior had to disband the office that collects revenues from oil, gas, and mining on federal lands because of corruption. The inspectors were being given Super Bowl tickets, bribes, prostitutes, and others to look the other way when companies were underpaying. So I just wanted to put on the table that this is a global problem, a global phenomenon, and affects any country that's dealing with extractive industries. Oxfam has been working on extractive industries and the impact of these industries in more than 30 countries for over a decade. And so we've seen these kinds of stories, the same kinds of stories that Roy is talking about, play out in many countries. In Africa, we've been working in places like Ghana and Burkina Faso. We're now working in places where these industries are only emerging. And it'll be important to talk about how you try to get some of these issues right at the beginning. Places like Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, which have recently discovered huge oil and gas deposits. But the common theme around all these countries, whether it's in Latin America, Asia, Africa, or even in the US, is that where these industries go, you're going to find corruption, you're going to find environmental degradation, you're going to find environmental abuses and human rights abuses. And so this is a broad pattern around the world.
And question to follow up on that, and then straight to you, Porter, as well, on the same question. Given that this issue is known about, Panama Papers is by far from the first time that any of us have really talked about offshore, I think it's fair to say, is an industry that hasn't had the cleanest reputation for a number of years now. Given that the extractive industry is known as somewhat problematic, and even Mossack Fonseca with its own files, as you'll know if you read the stories, knew internally that if a client or a customer was involved in any way in mining oil and gas, that was a sign to do extra work or to do extra due diligence or background checks to make sure they weren't getting caught up in anything. So why do you think we still have problems now, and what are the steps you think that African governments, and indeed the Western governments which you mentioned, that often house some of these facilitators, should do to improve the problems that you're seeing? And that's to both of you.
Sure, and I think there has been a lot of work over the last 15 years. Some of these issues around extractive industries, corruption, and human rights violations really came to the fore in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I think everybody will remember blood diamonds and the conflict diamonds issues. There was pioneering research by Global Witness and Human Rights Watch in Angola, looking at how oil was fueling corruption as well as the conflict in that country. I think there's a lot of good news to relay about how much progress that has been made in the last 15 years. You now have new laws in place in the US, in Canada, in the European Union, and Norway, which require any oil, gas, or mining company to disclose the payments that they make to governments wherever they're operating. And these laws are coming into force this year, and you're starting to see a tidal wave of information. So the way I look at it is this is sort of the Panama Papers, but by law, and it's going to happen every year. And so it'll be very interesting to see how journalists, civil society groups, other accountability actors will use this information. So for example, for the first time, Shell, not a Shell company, but Shell, the company, is disclosing the payments that they're making to the Nigerian government down to the individual project level, down to the individual contract level. So the first time, if you're a Nigerian living in the Niger Delta, you can see how much money is being paid, where it's going. And so that's huge progress. Roy mentioned contracts. A lot of companies are now saying that they're willing to disclose their contracts. Some oil companies disclose contracts wherever they operate. Many countries are now requiring contracts to be disclosed by law, such as Liberia, Peru, and others. And the World Bank is now requiring contract disclosure for any project that they finance. So there's a lot of progress that's been made, but there's a long way to go to get full accountability for these industries.
And to you, Porter, let me recast the question, I suppose. If there was just one thing that you would hope to see as a concrete outcome of Panama Papers, and don't feel as though just because you have some of us who worked on it, you need to say something nice, what would that be, and are we seeing any signs of it at the moment? And this can be from an American perspective or a more international perspective.
Well, thanks also for having me here. It's not going to be hard for me to say good things about your work. I'll rein myself in, and I'm going to give you two instead of one, so I'm not playing by the rules, sorry. Just a real quick introduction to our work. The Financial Transparency Coalition is a global coalition of nonprofits and experts and governments who are all working together to stem the tide of illicit financial flows out of Africa, but out of all of our economies. We do have a special focus on developing countries, and as you might sense, I am not African, but I work with colleagues in the coalition who have a better sense of the dynamics on the continent. Two big things that I would advocate for, that we have advocated for, are, and some of you will know this intimately and others of you will immediately glaze over, so I'll do my best to explain them in plain English. Finding out who the real owners are behind a company, and getting the full picture of multinationals' operations, not just in the extractives industries, but in real estate and luxury goods and technology, especially intellectual property has been a special boon to evasion and offshore antics, let's say. So right now, just to give you a sense, the public just can't figure out basic information about companies. They don't know who ultimately owns them, how much revenue they make, how much they pay in taxes. We don't know that stuff. So we, as ordinary citizens, have to provide a lot more information to get a library card or a driver's license than multinationals in almost every country in the world have to set up a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And that doesn't make any sense. That's crazy.
So basically, there are some things you can do. You can require the ultimate true beneficiary behind a company to be listed somewhere. So not a nominee, not a director, not someone who is somehow magically in charge of 30,000 companies, but the real person benefiting behind them. And to make that information public. Put it in a registry, put it online. The UK has already done this. We have now in the last few months seen Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa all committing to these public registries. So it and it's not just in Africa. There are over a dozen countries now around the globe who have made this commitment. Not that many who've done it yet, but in the next year or two, we're going to see these registries come online. And I hope that they are a boon to journalists because, I suspect that when these come online, the imperative will be on us to use them and to get this information out. And so that will be really important. And then just really quickly, or two for the other item on my list is, as I mentioned, sort of getting the full picture about a company's operations. So right now, the way that companies report, the big multinationals, is in this kind of global aggregate. So here's our entire kind of operations globally. They don't disaggregate on a country-by-country basis. So while we know that it's individual countries whose people and resources they require to make their products, it's sort of like they're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. So you kind of can't they're not being held accountable to individual countries. So you don't know whether they're paying their fair share of taxes. You don't know whether they're aggressively shifting their profits into low or no tax jurisdictions. You don't know if the company belongs to the nephew of a corrupt dictator. You don't know these things. The good news there is that, and sort of the second part of Will's question is this stuff happening? There is a debate about extending in the European Union about extending country-by-country reporting requirements beyond the extractives industry, beyond banking, to all industries, and that conversation is happening. However, there's a bit of a tendency by some of the European countries to want to limit this requirement to just EU member states and not a multinational's operations on a global level. So it doesn't really give us the full picture. So we'll be watching that very closely, and we've been very engaged in that debate. And so country-by-country reporting and the beneficial owners behind companies are two things that are not actually that complex to do and establish kind of fair rules of the road for the global financial system. So we don't think that they're particularly ambitious asks, and we've seen a lot of progress, I will say, in the last 5 years. And I can say that the difference in our advocacy between pre-LuxLeaks and now is night and day. So I'll stop the flattery, but thank you.
Thank you. LuxLeaks was another ICIJ project that looked at another batch of leaked documents that related to corporations in Europe and secret agreements some of these corporations had signed with authorities in Luxembourg, which is a founding member of the EU but also a highly secretive tax haven, and showed ways in which very well-known companies were able to slash their tax bills to sometimes less than 1%. I think I might here open up to some questions, unless either of you three wanted to follow up on a particular point.
Well, I would just want to make a particular point around beneficial ownership and the extractive industries sector. As I mentioned, there are a lot of reform efforts underway, including voluntary initiatives as well as new laws that are being put into place. One of the initiatives that's important is called the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a global voluntary initiative that includes companies, governments, and civil society organizations. One of the stories ICIJ released this week quotes the chair of the EITI about how important it is to unmask the owners of secret companies, which is somewhat ironic since EITI itself does not require beneficial ownership disclosure. That's been a big issue of debate within the decision-making structure of the voluntary initiative, and they've kicked the can down the road to 2020 as the point when they're going to start disclosing the beneficial owners. You can imagine the kinds of corruption and shady deals and illicit financial flows that will happen in the next 4 years while the EITI board drags its feet on beneficial ownership. So I think it's very important that we have not only a sense of outrage, but a sense of urgency, because what the Panama Papers show is that this is happening all the time, and we're talking about billions of dollars every year that are being siphoned out of Africa.
Just a final quick question. Beneficial ownership, which is knowing who the real owner of a company is, has come up a lot. For both of you, or for all three of you, why is that actually problematic? What harms are we seeing because of the nominees that Ray talked about, or the stand-in directors that some of you talked about?
I mean, the bottom line is, if you're paying a company like Mossack Fonseca for the secrecy, it's because you have a compelling reason to spend that money, and that you either, I mean, and you're reporting earlier in the year about people hiding money from their spouses in the case of a divorce, to something much more serious, that, you know, sort of stolen public funds, or you know, paying an effective tax rate of 1%. That basically you wouldn't go through the rigmarole of setting up an anonymous shell company unless you had a really compelling reason to keep that money out of public scrutiny. We haven't seen a lot of their, as Mo Ibrahim, the cell phone magnate, said a couple of years ago in an event, there is no good reason to have an anonymous shell company. I've searched and there isn't one. And you know, you should know, being an industry leader. So basically, if you're doing it, you're doing it because you're trying to evade accountability in some way or another.
Yeah, right.
Just add a few comments. When I look at the beneficial owners, it's a tricky subject, because the people, the rich people in this world are the people who are controlling most of the regulations in one way or another, which makes it very difficult to implement. But of course, there are some efforts to make sure that, you know, there must be some kind of transparency. But what it means is that you are looking at the big countries with their resources. I mean, that should be at the forefront in making sure that they do disclose. But from the information that we are getting, you also find out that it's a big issue in these developed countries when it comes to the issue of the beneficial owner. One wonders why it's an issue, because if money was, you know, put in that place in a proper way, which is illegal, there's no need to hide the beneficial owner. So the purpose of hiding the beneficial owner is because of the money was ill-gotten, I would want to think, because if the money was clean money without blood money on it, there is no need to hide the beneficial owner. This issue has become a very big problem in part of our research, where you find even Mossack Fonseca itself asking the same company so many times, can you please give us the beneficial owner? When they come, they put a list of shareholders. The shareholders, these are companies again, which are being listed as beneficial owners. But who are the beneficial owners of this company? I found that issue being repeated over and over again in the files that we have been looking at Mossack Fonseca. So I think, you know, it all needs, I think, international cooperation, and it has to start with the major players, EU, USA, you name them, to be smart and come up with laws, and then support other countries to make sure that everybody's done things in a transparent way. When you look at Africa, it's so painful that we are talking about 50 billion, which could be more than that. I mean, I think there's more money that is getting out of Africa. At the same time, again, there's aid that is coming to Africa, but I still think that if money that is coming in out of Africa had been used solely for the development of Africa, I think things would be working better. But the problem is that that money, when it goes out of Africa, is not coming back. It's going to be stuck there. It's not coming back.
I know we want to give you guys time for questions, but I may actually differ with your characterization of how we get the change, in the sense that what we have found is that, you know, as you say, that there's a small group of rich folks who are behind a lot of this stuff. The same thing is playing out on a kind of country-by-country diplomatic level. And so what we're seeing is a lot of interest in Africa and Asia and Latin America and Europe and the US. But the rules are getting made by a select few. The rules are being made by the OECD. You know, the excitement about Dodd-Frank in the US, the excitement about the regulations coming in the European Union is warranted. But a lot of these global norms and standards are being made kind of, you know, with a small group of countries, and then the way that the rest of the world can participate is in implementing the decisions that were already made. And that's not, for us, we care because it's a justice issue. We also care because it's not practical. This is a global problem. There is not going to be a way to solve it without involving the countries that are most affected by it. It's as you say, your principle in reporting is the communities that know. That is a microcosm of the larger sort of global debate. You cannot have this debate far away from those who are most affected. It's not going to work. So that's a strong caution about some of the rules we're seeing. It's great to see a lot of progress, but that progress, if it doesn't take into account, the way that it plays out in everybody's different contexts, it's not going to be effective.
Okay, speaking of progress, we might move on to some questions from the audience in the hope that there are some. Lauren, I just pass this around, I guess?
Yes.
Yep.
We're going to help with that.
Okay.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentations and kudos to all the journalists that participated in the Panama Papers. I had some questions about what happens after these reports come out because there's been some interesting response sort of globally from the suppliers of the corruption on like after the anti-corruption summit in the UK. We saw possibly some changes coming on, but then I think it's also really important what's happening on the ground in terms of law enforcement and prosecution. And you were sort of touching on it, but my question is, I'm not questioning that it's important that this information is out there, but if the information goes out there and you don't see any kind of justice taking place, what do you get really? You get maybe a cynical population that thinks that these people are, they're immune to any kind of prosecution. I know that maybe in different countries, justice systems are not, capacitated to sort of respond accordingly. Is there a role for journalists maybe in terms of the accountability of those justice sectors or law enforcement sectors to move this forward?
We might take maybe two more and then come back to it, just to keep things bubbling along. I see a hand up the back and now a face.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I've really been wanting to learn more about the Panama Papers, and I think it's really great that you're doing this specific focus on Africa. My colleague and I have conducted research on the effects of Al-Shabaab's organized criminal activities, corruption, and illicit financial streams in Somalia and its effect on the conflict in Somalia and terrorism in general. And I was wondering if the Panama Papers have revealed anything about this nexus between illicit financial activities and terrorism in Africa, Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, and I was wondering if any of you could speak to that.
Okay, we might address those two before I forget them. Ray, did you want to address the sense maybe you get in Zimbabwe about reaction? You've obviously spoken to and interviewed officials there in the wake of Panama Papers. What's happening in Zimbabwe, either publicly and even privately?
That's a very good question. After the story's out, what's next? What we've seen is that there is a realization that something needs to be done. Just recently, I think a couple of weeks ago, there was a tax forum meeting in South Africa where countries within the region, gathered to discuss this issue of tax evasion and things like that. To me, it's a development. I'm pretty sure it's a result of the Panama stories. At an individual level, I've also seen that sometimes people tend to think, okay, so what's next? Why do I have to care? It appears as if in certain societies, people do not really understand that the money coming from these resources is their money. And I think probably civil society and other organizations need to sort of, take that further. Our job as journalists is to report what is going on and based on facts and the information that we have. But to move forward, I think it's another education. Some people tend to think that, okay, so if they've taken that money, why should I bother? But the truth of the matter is that those resources are supposed to benefit people in those communities. And the more people start to understand that somebody is stealing their resources, I think they'll be moving towards some kind of understanding and putting pressure to their local governments and the government to act with issues like this. With regard to the stories that we have written, what I heard was that the government was going to investigate. And what I thought was the starting point is that since there were names and things like that, I was going to hear that such a company has been brought before the courts. Up to now, I'm still to wait to hear that. I'm hearing that investigations are still going on. How are they doing the investigations? This is being kept as a secret, but I know for sure that the central bank has lined up individuals who have been named in the Panama Papers to go and explain and get interrogated by the central bank. But at the same time, again, I'm hearing the central bank offered some kind of amnesty to certain individuals, that those who put the money outside the country, if they bring them back, they won't be prosecuted. Some kind of amnesty. I don't know whether that works, but it's a formula which the central bank thinks is the best way of dealing with the problem. There is a general feeling among financial experts that when some of these people were doing it, they did not really know that they were committing a crime. Is it true? It's anyone's guess.
I think they didn't find out intentionally. It's a bit of a circular loop, just to answer your question really quickly. When we talk to law enforcement, and this is in the U.S. context, but also elsewhere, when we talk to law enforcement and prosecutors and others, it does seem as if there have been a lot of investigations opened as a result of the leaks. But those investigations come to a dead end because law enforcement has no access to who's ultimately behind a company. So it's one of those things where we actually, you can build capacity, but the laws need to change as well. And Ray's point about building political will and that being our job as civil society, I think is well taken. We need to push for it, but even law enforcement inside the government, who you imagine might have more information than we do, really don't, and have become our strongest advocates.
Well, I think two comments. One is what happens to the information that is being disclosed in the extractive industries beyond the Panama Papers and the great stories that have come out, the information around what governments are being paid. I think that is a vital piece of information. It's not a silver bullet, but without that information, it's impossible to have a democratic debate about how these resources should be used. And for an American audience where there is some private ownership of oil and mining, this may seem a little bit strange, but in the rest of the world, anything subsoil is generally owned by the state and managed by the government on behalf of the people. So as Ray is talking about, making that strong connection between the people, the government, and taxation is something that's really hard in countries where extractive industries dominate, because the money is flowing from private companies straight into government coffers. And so you have situations where somebody who's a market woman selling soap probably pays more taxes than the mining company down the road. You have those are not hypothetical examples, those are real examples. But there are positive cases where information is being disclosed and people are using information. So we do a lot of work in Ghana. By law, the oil companies have to disclose their payments, the government discloses the budgets, and citizens and farmers are mobilizing to get more of that money spent on agriculture. And they've been successful, and they're following the money down to individual projects that are improving the livelihoods of farmers. So we're seeing the theory of change play out in certain contexts, but it's true that it's hard work.
Thank you. And I'll just jump in on Somalia and say, alas, no. I haven't heard any one of us come across that story yet. I would say, though, that don't lose hope. What ICIJ has tried to do by the release of the public database is to make available to not just the 500 journalists working on Panama Papers, but to every man and his dog, potential indicators that at least can be the beginning of further investigation. I would also say the Panama Papers is the beginning of a long chapter and long book that is yet to be written, in that information that we have now may be insufficient for what we could do in the future. In some cases, the Panama Papers stories only came to light through legal disclosure and court documents, for example. And in that case, for example, one I wrote on Algeria a few days ago, 12 of the 17 companies that are currently under investigation in Italy in relation to multi-million-dollar bribes for oil in Algeria, 12 of those 7 offshore companies under investigation were created by Mossack Fonseca. Within the files themselves, those companies give very little away. One of them says it's a consultancy company. If I hadn't seen that Italian court document, that would have been the end of the story, right? So it's through further research by external actors and journalists that I think Panama Papers will open itself up to even more research in the future. There was something right at the back.
Hi, my name is Ladi. I'm sorry I came in late.
Oh, hi.
Yes, a lot of Nigerians were on the Panama Papers list, and I report for a Nigerian newspaper. What we have seen happening since then, since the report started coming out, is that there's been a lot of, how would you say, for want of a better word, very coldness towards us as reporters. You know, of course, that I would say 80%, and that's been very remote, of the Nigerians named government officials who are still in power up till now. And most of them, some of them, you know, date back up to 1998 when we were still under the military dictatorship. And so perhaps because a lot of them are still on the corridors of power, there has been very lukewarm reaction from even the corrective government, corruption-wise, that we have now. There has been, to our knowledge so far, no reaction from the Buhari government, from law enforcement, from EFCC, our Economic and Financial Crimes Unit, specifically based on revelations from the Panama Papers. The good thing, if you like, is that the Panama Papers came out at the time there were already some cases of corruption being prosecuted. And good enough, some of the people who were already being focused on were on the Panama Papers. Saraki and his wife, Saraki is the Senate president and his wife, and of course a good many other people. What I think the kind of help we see, as journalists see that should be the next step forward in Nigeria is that perhaps because the revelations came from outside Nigeria, even the people themselves have been kind of lukewarm in reacting to it. They hadn't been that because, we've been having cases of Nigerian assets flying out since God knows when. We've had scandals about discovery of money and assets outside Nigeria, that originated from Nigeria, outside Nigeria since God knows when. So there is an unhealthy level of apathy, even among the population itself. This is where we need a lot of help from outside the country. For example, even as the Senate president's wife was being investigated, even before she surfaced again on the Panama Papers, she was here in the US, contributed some, she made a contribution towards some PBS program, for instance, earlier this year, and had her name flashed around, as a contributor. In other words, the accusations come from here, and a lot of the laundry washing, also happens here in this part of the world. So the apathy is that there's a sort of feeling among the population that, well, it's not, the problem is far from us, it's remote, because the accusations came from this part, and there has been no effort at all, for example, on the part of Senator David Mack, who used to be a governor, and who had been who has had his shell companies since the 1990s, late 90s. He hasn't come out to apologize, hasn't come out to explain, he's been going about his life as if, it's just one of those things. This is a guy who, part of the investigation we're doing now, we know that, for example, that some of the assets he had abroad that came out, we know, for example, that it came from contract that he was supposed to have implemented, fixing roads from the capital of city, Abuja, to his own ancestral village. And now this man, of course the roads have not been fixed, and now he flies home in a helicopter. Nobody has, shut down his helicopter. Nobody has protested since the revelations coming. So we do need a little bit more help from here. I don't know in what form it's going to take, but we need a little bit, I don't know, I hope we'll be able to figure it out in a forum like this at some point. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone, that was Ladi, who is the correspondent in Washington for Premium Times, which is one of Nigeria's best news outlets, a partner of ICIJ on Panama Papers, who I think literally for 2 weeks were publishing front page stories on revelations each day, but as you heard there, not always with the greatest impact. There was a question just here, but I'm going to lose my microphone, so I'll walk backwards.
Thank you. James Cohen with U.S. Institute of Peace. Thanks for the presentation. I'm just wondering, you were talking about the idea of coalitions and the actors that are coming about need to work together. Given the scope that Panama Papers are revealing about the nature of corruption, not just about theft, but tagging onto, as somebody pointed out, onto terrorism, onto conflict, it goes beyond a large scope of actors. So being in the security field, tend to talk to other security NGOs. The idea of talking to bankers and finance people is a kind of foreign concept. Do you see, after the Panama Papers, more organizations wanting to work together in larger coalitions to figure out how they can pair up? UNDPKO talking to HSBC, talking to EITI in other areas, and seeing where they complement each other instead of working in siloed factors?
I'm really glad you asked that question, actually. Absolutely. One of the biggest things we do right now is outreach to private sector actors who may be more inclined to worry about this, and particularly, say, institutional investors who think about risk all the time, and for whom, hiding losses offshore, could mean the next massive bubble. And we've had, a really positive response from reaching out to them. Yeah, absolutely. And it's not accidental that we have government members of the coalition. These governments have seen, typically starts with a study that shows how much foregone tax revenue in their country, and all of a sudden they say, yes, we'd really like to work with you because this is a problem. There's something in this for everyone, and I think the lady from Premium Times, your point is well taken that I think we try to solve this problem at the national level at our peril. We absolutely have to work together, and some of you will know this, but Delaware is the #2 financial secrecy jurisdiction in the world. So the idea that this is somehow a developing country problem is definitely not true. That we are all too welcoming of funds from other people's thieves, let's say. And so that's something that I think it's really, really important to work in coalition across sectors, but also in coalition across countries. We're not going to get this done in a vacuum, but that is happening. I will say that is happening increasingly. If you're interested to know who the players are, financialtransparency.org is a good place to start. But yeah, point well taken. We need to be creative about this, and as I say, I never would have predicted that law enforcement would be one of our biggest champions. So you can find strange bedfellows for sure.
Yeah, did you want to add on that?
Just to add on the extractive industries transparency front, we've had a Odd Bedfellows coalition for a long time, and including the underlying legislation that ended up in the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act was called the Energy Security Through Transparency Act, and it included Republican and Democratic sponsors, and it was specifically from the national security angle, terrorist financing angle, and other angles that we got some Republicans interested in the issue of transparency in the sector. In the implementation of this act with the Securities and Exchange Commission, we've had submissions from all over the world, getting back to Porter's point about involvement in legislation, rulemaking, and norm setting. We've had civil society groups from all over the world, Nigerian trade unions, and investors worth more than $10 trillion in assets under management, including many mainstream investors who see that these types of situations pose material risk for the companies that they have holdings in. So I think as much as we can think about creative ways to break down those silos, the more we're going to be successful.
I think we've run out of time. Is anyone going to stop me if I continue? 5 more minutes? Okay.
Hi. So my question deals with the effect of the Panama Papers on efforts by Transparency International and Interpol to retrieve funds from former dictators who have offshore accounts in different countries. I want to ask specifically, do you think that the release of these papers can help I guess speed up the process of retrieving those lost funds? I remember reading sometime last year that there was a former Nigerian official who had siphoned tens of millions of dollars out of the country, and it took about 10 years for the international organizations to return it back to the country. So do you think that these papers could help speed that up, maybe cut the time that it takes to retrieve those funds?
I can briefly address that, and then others can add if they wish. In a particular case, I was speaking to someone at Nigeria's Economic Financial Crimes Commission just the other week about ongoing investigations, and we were talking about the British Virgin Islands, and he told me, I've got no idea what relates to Nigeria in the BVI, whereas Panama Papers tells you exactly what's happening with Nigerians in the BVI, and what Nigeria is obliged to do, therefore, is to make official diplomatic and legal requests through other third parties, such as Switzerland, such as the United Kingdom, such as the USA, so they can then make the request on behalf of Nigeria to the British Virgin Islands. So I would like to think that some of the information that we've published and stories we've produced would allow certain governments to connect the dots in a much more efficient manner than they would otherwise be able to do. But ultimately, much more broadly than that, I would hope people would then realise, well, this shouldn't be something we have to wait for journalists to do. Why isn't that every government and every nation can be on an even keel and make that request without having to faff around and lose years, as you say, in the request of this money?
One of the things that's happening is that there's a demand for automatic and regular exchange of financial information across governments. And that's something that will be key. But in terms of asset recovery after the fact, maybe you're thinking of Sani Abacha, that it takes a long time. It's really expensive. It's very appealing to the public conscience because this is money that is that belonged to the public, and it's very motivating as such. It's a lot easier to stop it from happening than it is to get it back. And that is not to say that it's not a really important cause, but because we are trying to focus on the future, and we are a small band, even though we are global, we're really focused on getting this regular exchange between governments that makes it a lot easier to sense, because otherwise you're poking around, you have all of these treaties with a million different governments, you're poking around, you have to know what you don't know before you know it in order to ask the question, and the question takes a while to hear back. It's a painful process, and the people who engage in it are heroes for sure. But just to say we'd like to stop it before it leaves.
So one more hand here. just in the front here, Lauren.
Okay, we'll sneak one more in.
Perfect.
Thanks very much. My name is Sierra Ramirez, and I'm from the Open Contracting Partnership. So, Ian, I heard you mention earlier the progress that's been made around contracting transparency as it relates to the extractive industries. And what I'd like to know is if any of you have heard about instances where resources like the resourcecontracts.org websites or any kind of databases or anything that are hosting these disclosed contracts have been in any way like linked or analyzed with respect to the Panama Papers database itself. So trying to link these data and get some insights out of that can perhaps move this forward.
Should I speak that, or do you want to?
Well, I can speak to the fact that I think it's a great idea, and I'd love to see if there are, full contracts around natural resource deals in the Panama Papers to get them posted on resourcecontracts.org or other, like the Open Oil Repository. That's a great suggestion, and I don't know, Will, whether that's something that would be possible.
Right. Final question, putting me on the spot. I know that many of our partners have published contracts, or at least parts of them, when they have reported on stories. And you would know better than I, there are very intelligent people working in this open contract area who I'm sure have done lots of matching already, not necessarily between contracts that are available, but even contract parties, I think, which you would see now with the release of the Panama Papers public database. That would enable you to say, okay, BVI entity X is in Panama Papers, and we know that they've also signed a contract in Azerbaijan or Kenya, for example. So there's certainly a lot more to do. And I think as this Africa reporting round showed, and as Ray's long-term digging into this matter shows, is that when it comes to natural resources and when it comes not only to Africa but the entire world, this is stuff that takes a long time to do, and no doubt there'll be more to come.
Well, we all really appreciate you coming out and discussing this with us, and I'm grateful to Will, Ray, Porter, and Ian for coming and showing your expertise and helping answer some of these questions, and I have a feeling this discussion will continue on. So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Not quite off the record.
Good to see you. No, yeah, the brains behind the data and everything.
Yes. I want to follow up. We had a closed door meeting recently.
Good to see you. Hi, how are you? Oh, nice to meet you. Thank you.
Research. And I actually went to Mozambique with the desire to do research on this issue, and I ended up doing research on another issue.
Okay. So what
I was looking at the effectiveness of development projects in the area of food security and sustainable agriculture. So it was a sidestep, but I chose this research for sort of safety concerns. So it's an interesting issue, as a foreigner working in different environments, trying to navigate the way in which you can operate in a safe environment. And even though living there, I came across so many stories that were of like great journalistic quality. I have documented, these stories that no one has ever published.